Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something ancient, supposedly pleasurable, and absolutely exhausting. We're exploring the brutal reality of Epicurean pleasure calculations. You might think a philosophy based on pleasure sounds appealing. You wake up in the Garden of Epicurus in Athens, 306 BCE. The sun is rising over marble columns. Birds are singing. Flowers bloom in carefully tended beds. It looks like paradise. Then someone hands you a wax tablet covered in calculations. Your assignment for today: determine whether the pleasure of listening to those birds outweighs Burr's potential distraction from your studies. You have until sunset. This is your life now. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, the screen will soon go dark too, and let's begin this evening's journey together. Welcome to the Garden of Epicurus, where every sensation requires paperwork. You've just arrived at what appears to be the most beautiful philosophical community in ancient Athens. Marble pathways wind between blooming oleander and olive trees. Fountains bubble with clear water. The morning light filters through grapevines, casting dancing shadows on white stone benches. Even the air smells perfect, like honey and jasmine. This is where the wealthy and educated come to study the art of living well. This is where happiness has been scientifically perfected. Your first morning begins at dawn because sleep itself requires analysis. Too much sleep reduces available pleasure hours. Too little sleep impairs your ability to calculate pleasure accurately. The optimal amount must be determined daily based on variables including weather, your current health status, planned activities, emotional state, and the position of the stars. A senior student explains this while you're still rubbing your eyes. She's been here 3 years and can calculate optimal sleep duration in under 20 minutes. You're impressed until she mentions it took her 2 years to reach that level of efficiency. The garden operates on principles that sound simple but require extensive implementation procedures. Pleasure is the highest good. Pain should be avoided. Live simply. Don't fear death. Each of these concepts comes with detailed subcategories, measurement systems, and daily practice requirements. The philosophy may be about enjoying life, but first you must attend orientation. Orientation lasts 6 hours and covers the filing system. Every sensation you experience must be logged, categorized, and evaluated. Physical pleasures are divided into kinetic pleasures, which involve motion and stimulation, and katastomatic pleasures, which involve rest and the absence of pain. Each category has subcategories. Kinetic pleasures include eating, drinking, sexual activity, exercise, and listening to music. But within eating, you must distinguish between pleasures derived from taste, texture, temperature, aroma, and nutritional satisfaction. You start taking notes. Your hand cramps within the first hour. The instructor, a thin man named Apollodorus who speaks very slowly and blinks often, explains that mental pleasures require even more detailed analysis. Joy must be separated from contentment, which differs from satisfaction, which is distinct from serenity. Hope is categorized differently from anticipation. Relief is not the same as gratitude. Love has 17 subcategories depending on its object, intensity, duration, and reciprocity status. You ask if there's a chart. There are several charts. Large ones. After orientation, you're assigned a mentor. Her name is Metrodora, and she's been practicing Epicurean philosophy for 15 years. She has the calm, measured speech of someone who has learned to calculate the value of every word before speaking it. She explains that your first month will focus on basic pleasure recognition. You cannot properly calculate what you cannot properly identify. This sounds reasonable until she hands you your daily schedule. Your day begins with morning pleasure assessment. Upon waking, you must evaluate the quality of your sleep, the comfort of your bedding, the temperature of the air, and your general physical condition. Each element receives a numerical rating from 1 to 10, with detailed justification required for any score above 5. You then calculate whether getting out of bed will increase or decrease your overall daily pleasure total. This typically takes 45 minutes. By the time you finish, you need to reassess because your bladder situation has changed. Morning ablutions require their own calculations. Water temperature for washing must balance the immediate pleasure of warmth against the numbing effect of excessive heat. Soap, a luxury item, must be weighed against its cost and the pleasure duration of cleanliness versus the brief sensory joy of application. Even brushing your teeth becomes complex. The pleasure of oral cleanliness must be measured against the minor pain of the brush bristles and the bitter taste of the cleaning powder. Metrodora watches you brush your teeth while taking notes on a wax tablet. She nods approvingly when you wince at the powder taste but continue brushing. Pain acceptance is an advanced concept. Breakfast presents your first major daily challenge. The garden practices communal dining, which means your food choices affect others' pleasure calculations. The bread is fresh, warm, and smells magnificent, but eating it provides kinetic pleasure, which is temporary and may lead to attachment. Calculating its value requires considering the immediate sensory pleasure, the satisfaction of hunger relief, the nutritional benefits, the social pleasure of sharing with others, and the potential future pain of wanting more bread when none is available. You stare at the bread for 12 minutes. It gets cold. This affects your calculations because cold bread provides less sensory pleasure. You start over. Metrodora explains that experienced practitioners can complete breakfast calculations in under 5 minutes. The key is developing standardized pleasure units and personal baseline measurements. Every food item has been analyzed by previous students. Bread scores an average of 6.3 for taste, 4.7 for satisfaction duration, and 8.1 for social harmony when shared. These numbers are written in a large book that everyone consults before eating. The book has 847 pages. There's a waiting list to use it. While you're calculating bread values, other students are working through their own assignments. A young man named Hermarchus is determining whether the morning sunlight hitting his face constitutes a significant pleasure event worth documenting, or a minor sensation that can be grouped with other environmental comfort factors. His brow is furrowed in concentration. He's been sitting in the same patch of sunlight for an hour, occasionally shifting position to test pleasure variations based on angle and intensity. Another student, Polyanus, is conducting a comparative analysis of sitting versus standing while having philosophical discussions. He's been alternating positions every 10 minutes and recording comfort levels, attention span, and social dynamics in each configuration. The garden has 43 current residents, and everyone's calculations affect everyone else's. Communal property means individual pleasure decisions become group optimization problems. If you choose to pick flowers for personal enjoyment, you're reducing everyone else's visual pleasure from seeing them in the garden. If you take a long bath, you're using hot water that others might need. If you spend too much time reading in the library, you're preventing others from accessing books. Every personal pleasure must be weighed against community pleasure. There are formulas for this. They're complicated. Your first philosophical discussion begins after breakfast once everyone has completed their morning calculations. The topic is desire classification, which sounds abstract until you realize it's a practical sorting system for every want, need, or impulse you might experience. Desires are divided into 3 categories: natural and necessary, natural but not necessary, and vain desires that exist only due to false opinions. Food when hungry is natural and necessary. Sexual pleasure is natural but not necessary. Fame is a vain desire. Each category requires different management strategies and pleasure calculations. The discussion grows heated when someone asks about the desire for knowledge. Is wanting to understand philosophy natural and necessary, natural but not necessary, or potentially vain if it becomes excessive? The group spends 2 hours debating this point while referring to several previous discussions on the same topic. No conclusion is reached, but extensive notes are taken for future reference. Knowledge-seeking desire remains unclassified pending further analysis. During lunch, you discover that eating has become significantly more complex since breakfast. Now that you've attended the desire classification discussion, you must evaluate not just the food's pleasure value, but also which type of desire it satisfies. The hunger for food is natural and necessary, so eating should provide pure pleasure. But enjoying the taste beyond basic nutritional satisfaction becomes natural, but not necessary pleasure, which requires more careful calculation. And if you start wanting specific foods rather than accepting whatever's available, you risk developing vain desires based on false opinions about food superiority. You eat olives very slowly while thinking about this. The afternoon is dedicated to practical pleasure exercises. Your first assignment is to spend 1 hour in the garden experiencing nature mindfully while documenting all sensations for later analysis. This sounds peaceful until Metrodora explains the documentation requirements. Every 5 minutes you must record temperature, visual observations, sounds, smells, physical comfort level, emotional state, and any thoughts that arise. Each observation must be rated for pleasure intensity and duration. Distracting thoughts must be noted and categorized as either useful for future calculations or harmful to present moment awareness. You find a comfortable spot under a fig tree and begin your nature observation. The shade is pleasant, rating about a 6 for temperature comfort. Birds are singing, which provides auditory pleasure you estimate at 5.5, though this might increase if you could identify the species and appreciate their song structure more fully. The fig tree's leaves rustle in a light breeze, creating visual movement you rate as mildly pleasant, perhaps a 4. You write all this down. 5 minutes have passed. Time to observe again. The second observation period reveals that your position under the tree has become less comfortable due to a small root pressing against your back. This reduces physical pleasure from 6 to 4.5. However, the bird songs have increased in complexity, raising auditory pleasure to 6.2. A butterfly has landed on a nearby flower, adding visual interest that scores approximately 5.8 for beauty and 3.2 for novelty. You are getting faster at the calculations, which feels like progress until you realize you are spending more time writing than observing. Metrodora watches from across the garden, occasionally making notes of her own. By the third observation period, you notice that constantly analyzing the experience is changing the experience itself. The butterfly is still beautiful, but you're looking at it differently now, evaluating its color saturation and wing pattern symmetry, rather than simply enjoying its presence. The bird songs have become data points rather than music. Even the comfortable shade feels like something you're testing rather than experiencing. You write this down as a meta-observation about the interaction between analysis and direct experience. Metrodora will be pleased. This level of self-awareness takes most students weeks to develop. Your hour of nature observation concludes with a synthesis session. You must review all your recordings and calculate your total pleasure units for the experience. This involves averaging your ratings, adjusting for pleasure duration and intensity, and factoring in the learning value of the exercise itself. The mathematics longer than the original observation period. Your final score is 5.67 pleasure units per hour, which Metrodora notes is quite good for a beginner. She mentions that advanced students regularly achieve scores above 7.5 for the same activity. You ask how they do it. More practice, she says, and better calculation methods. The late afternoon brings individual study time, which means reading Epicurus's extensive writings on pleasure theory while taking detailed notes. The texts are complex, filled with subtle distinctions and careful definitions. You learn that pleasure is not merely the presence of enjoyment, but specifically the absence of pain. This distinction requires memorization and practical application. True pleasure ataraxia is a state of perfect tranquility that can only be achieved through careful management of desires and rational calculation of outcomes. It sounds simple in theory. The implementation manual is 400 pages long. Your reading is interrupted by the evening meal preparation, which operates on a rotation system where everyone participates in cooking calculations. Tonight's menu planning session involves determining the optimal balance of nutritional value, taste pleasure, preparation effort, and ingredient cost for a meal serving 43 people with varying dietary preferences, health conditions, and philosophical opinions about food. The discussion begins with whether to serve fish or lentils and expands into a detailed analysis of protein sources, cooking methods, seasoning options, and portion sizes. 2 hours later, you're having bread and olives again. The calculation to meal ratio seems suboptimal, but you don't mention this because you haven't developed a formula for measuring it yet. Evening discussion focuses on the day's pleasure achievements and areas for improvement. Each resident shares their highest and lowest pleasure calculations, explaining their methodology and requesting feedback from the group. A senior student named Lucretius achieved 8.2 pleasure units during his afternoon scroll copying session by implementing a new technique for managing hand cramps while maintaining focus on textual beauty. Another student, Diogenes of Tarsus, experienced negative pleasure during his garden weeding assignment due to inadequate pre-activity stretching and insufficient analysis of optimal body positions for repetitive motion tasks. When your turn comes, you report on your nature observation exercise and the calculated 5.67 pleasure units per hour. The group responds with encouraging nods and several questions about your rating methodology. Someone asks whether you accounted for the pleasure of learning about pleasure during the observation. Someone else wonders if the meta-analysis of the observation process should be calculated separately from the direct sensory experience. A third person suggests that your butterfly pleasure rating might be artificially low due to inadequate preparation in lepidopteran aesthetic appreciation. You take notes on all their suggestions while trying to remember what you actually felt when you saw the butterfly. The day concludes with evening meditation, which involves lying quietly while systematically reviewing every pleasure and pain experienced during the past 24 hours. This is not a relaxation exercise. This is comprehensive data analysis performed in a reclined position. You must recall each sensation, verify your original pleasure calculations, and adjust them based on how the experiences feel in memory versus how they felt in the moment. Some pleasures increase in value when remembered, while others diminish. Pain often seems more tolerable in retrospect, but this might be due to relief at its absence rather than actual value change. These variables must be factored into future decision-making calculations. Your first night in the garden ends with you lying on a simple bed, staring at the ceiling while your brain processes pleasure equations. The bed is moderately comfortable, rating approximately 6.1 for softness and 5.8 for temperature regulation. The room is quiet enough for quality sleep, though you can hear other residents also conducting their evening reviews through thin walls. Occasionally someone mutters numbers or sighs deeply. The sound is oddly comforting, rating perhaps 4.3 for social connection and 6.7 for philosophical solidarity. You close your eyes and try to sleep, but your mind keeps calculating. This exceeds the beginner baseline of 95 units per day, which should indicate successful philosophical practice. However, you spent 4.7 hours on calculations themselves, which seems to reduce the time available for actual pleasure experiences. Tomorrow you'll need to work on calculation efficiency to maximize the pleasure to analysis ratio. You drift off while mentally designing a formula for measuring analytical overhead costs. In your dreams, you're still calculating. Even your subconscious has learned to rate experiences numerically. The butterfly appears again, but now it has numbers on its wings. Metrodora is there, taking notes on your dream performance. You wake up several times during the night to jot down insights about pleasure optimization, because good ideas can't wait until morning when you might have calculated them differently. This is day 1 in the garden. You have several hundred days ahead of you before achieving basic competency in Epicurean philosophy. By then, you'll be able to calculate the pleasure value of breathing without conscious effort. You'll know the exact pleasure differential between sitting and standing, between speaking and listening, between looking and seeing. You'll have optimized your daily pleasure intake with scientific precision. The sun rises again over the marble columns, and someone hands you a fresh wax tablet. Today's assignment: determine whether yesterday's pleasure calculations were themselves pleasurable enough to justify the time spent on them. You begin writing numbers before you're fully awake. This feels like progress. Your second day begins with advanced pleasure mathematics. Metrodora arrives at your door before sunrise, carrying a leather satchel filled with calculation instruments. Today you'll learn to quantify joy using the standard Epicurean measurement system. She spreads out bronze instruments on your small table, a pleasure scale with weights marked in hedonic units, measuring cups for liquid satisfaction, and a complex abacus designed specifically for emotional calculations. The morning light catches the polished bronze, creating what would normally be a beautiful sight. You're too busy learning the conversion rates between different pleasure types to notice. The basic unit of pleasure, Metrodora explains, is called a hedon. 1 hedon equals the satisfaction derived from drinking clean water when moderately thirsty. This baseline was established by Epicurus himself after extensive testing under controlled conditions. All other pleasures are measured against this standard. A perfectly ripe fig eaten when hungry rates approximately 1.3 hedons. Sexual pleasure with someone you love peaks around 2.1 hedons, but drops rapidly in subsequent measurements due to satisfaction saturation. The pleasure of completing a difficult intellectual task averages 1.7 hedons, but can vary significantly based on task complexity and personal aptitude for the subject matter. Physical pleasures follow different calculation rules than mental pleasures. Physical pleasures are immediate but temporary, creating sharp peaks in your daily hedon count followed by rapid declines. Mental pleasures build more slowly but maintain their value longer, creating what advanced students call sustained pleasure curves. Your daily goal is to achieve optimal pleasure distribution across both categories, while avoiding the common beginner mistake of hedon clustering, where you experience all your pleasure units in a short period and spend the rest of the day in pleasure deficit. The mathematics become complex quickly. Simple addition doesn't work because pleasure units decay over time at different rates depending on their source and intensity. A 1.5 hedon experience from eating honey will lose 0.3 hedons per hour due to memory fade and physical satisfaction decrease. However, a 1.5 hedon experience from reading beautiful poetry only loses 0.1 hedons per hour and might actually increase in value if you understand the text better upon reflection. These decay rates must be calculated individually for each experience and factored into your daily planning equations. Metrodora demonstrates the proper technique by calculating the pleasure value of the sunrise you're currently witnessing. First, she measures the visual beauty component using the bronze pleasure scale. The colors rate 1.2 hedons, the light quality adds 0.8 hedons, and the overall composition contributes 0.6 hedons for a base visual pleasure of 2.6 hedons. However, this must be adjusted for viewing conditions. Having to hold calculation equipment while viewing reduces mindful appreciation by 0.4 hedons. The educational value of witnessing the demonstration adds 0.3 hedons. Final sunrise pleasure rating, 2.3 hedons with a decay rate of 0.15 hedons per hour. The calculation takes 47 minutes. Metrodora notes this timing differential but doesn't comment on its implications. Advanced practitioners can complete sunrise calculations in real time, she mentions, though this requires years of practice and extremely fast handwriting. She shows you her calculation tablet, covered in tiny, precise numbers that look more like accounts from a grain merchant than philosophical observations. The handwriting is so small you need to squint to read it. Your first independent calculation assignment involves rating the pleasure of breakfast porridge. The porridge sits before you in a simple clay bowl, steaming slightly, with a small portion of honey on the side. This looks straightforward until Metrodora hands you the official porridge calculation worksheet. The form has 17 sections covering grain quality, cooking texture, temperature optimization, sweetener integration, nutritional satisfaction, social context, and eating utensil comfort analysis. Each section requires measurements, comparisons to baseline standards, and adjustment calculations based on personal factors like hunger level and recent food history. You begin with grain quality assessment. The oats appear to be of medium grade, with minimal foreign matter and an acceptable color uniformity. According to the reference charts, medium grade oats provide a base pleasure rating of 0.7 hedons, which can be increased by up to 0.3 hedons for superior preparation, or decreased by up to 0.5 hedons for poor cooking technique. Your porridge shows signs of proper cooking, no burn particles, appropriate moisture content, and uniform consistency. This adds 0.2 hedons to the grain-based score for a subtotal of 0.9 hedons from the oat component alone. Temperature analysis requires a completely different calculation method. The ideal serving temperature for porridge has been determined through extensive experimentation to be exactly 127 degrees Fahrenheit, which provides maximum mouth pleasure without risk of burning. Your porridge is cooling rapidly in the morning air, losing approximately 3 degrees per minute. By the time you finish the grain quality calculations, the temperature has dropped to 119 degrees, reducing pleasure value by 0.15 hedons. You must eat quickly to prevent further temperature loss, but eating quickly reduces mindful appreciation, which carries its own hedon penalty. This creates what the advanced texts call a pleasure optimization paradox. The honey presents additional complications. Applied to hot porridge, honey provides 1.1 hedons of sweetness pleasure and 0.4 hedons of textural enhancement as it melts and blends with the oats. However, honey also contains natural sugars that create temporary pleasure spikes followed by energy crashes, potentially causing negative hedons later in the day. The calculation worksheet includes a complex formula for projecting honey-related pleasure debt based on your individual sugar metabolism, recent exercise levels, and planned afternoon activities. You realize you don't know your individual sugar metabolism rate. This requires separate testing that takes 3 days to complete. Metrodora watches you struggle with the honey calculations and takes pity. For beginners, she explains, honey pleasure debt can be estimated using the standard template values, which assume average metabolism and moderate daily activity. This simplification introduces some calculation error, but the alternative is not eating till you complete comprehensive metabolic testing. Most new students choose the estimation method. Your porridge is now completely cold, but you've learned valuable lessons about the relationship between analytical precision and practical pleasure achievement. The spoon itself requires evaluation. Made of carved wood with a slightly rough handle, it provides adequate functionality but limited sensory pleasure. The texture against your lips rates 0.2 hedons, while the ergonomic comfort scores 0.3 hedons. A bronze spoon would provide better mouthfeel but risks metallic taste interference. A perfectly smooth wooden spoon would be optimal but expensive and difficult to obtain. You make notes about potential eating utensil upgrades for future consideration while eating increasingly lukewarm porridge with a slightly uncomfortable spoon. Your final porridge score totals 2.7 hedons, assuming standard honey debt calculations and ignoring the temperature loss penalty, which would have required real-time consumption that conflicts with proper analysis procedures. Metrodora reviews your work and notes several calculation errors, including failure to account for the social pleasure of shared breakfast experience and insufficient consideration of nutritional satisfaction duration. She estimates your actual porridge pleasure value at closer to 2.1 hedons. The recalculation process takes 23 minutes. The bowl is now empty and cold. After breakfast, you join a group discussion on desire classification, which sounds like philosophy but functions more like an extremely detailed filing system. Desires are divided into three main categories, each with multiple subcategories that require careful identification before proper pleasure calculations can be performed. Natural and necessary desires include food, shelter, safety, and friendship. These desires provide high pleasure when satisfied and cause significant pain when ignored. Natural but unnecessary desires include luxury foods, elaborate housing, sexual pleasure, and entertainment. These can provide pleasure but aren't required for happiness and may create problematic attachment patterns. Vain desires include fame, immortality, and being remembered after death. These desires can never be truly satisfied and should be eliminated through rational analysis. The classification system sounds simple until you start applying it to real situations. Is the desire for honey in your porridge natural but unnecessary, or has regular honey consumption made it feel natural and necessary? Is wanting a more comfortable spoon a reasonable natural desire for functional tools or a vain desire for luxury? Is enjoying the sunrise a natural appreciation of beauty, or an unnecessary aesthetic indulgence that could lead to attachment to specific visual experiences? The group spends 2 hours debating whether the desire to understand philosophy itself should be classified as natural and necessary for intellectual beings, or natural but unnecessary, since survival doesn't depend on philosophical knowledge. Apollodorus, the thin instructor who blinks frequently, leads the discussion with methodical patience. He has apparently been thinking about desire classification for 12 years and has developed 17 subcategories for food-related desires alone. There are natural necessary food desires for basic nutrition, natural unnecessary desires for specific flavors or textures, and vain food desires for rare or expensive items that demonstrate social status. But within natural necessary food desires, you must distinguish between desires for adequate calories, complete nutritional requirements, food safety, and eating comfort. Each subcategory has different pleasure calculation methods and satisfaction strategies. A senior student named Leontien shares her personal desire classification system, which she's been refining for 8 years. She's identified 247 distinct types of desires that she encounters in daily life, each with detailed analysis protocols and management techniques. Her desire taxonomy includes subcategories like desire for intellectual stimulation during meals, desire for specific sitting positions during meditation, and desire for variety in daily walking routes. She's currently working on classification criteria for meta-desires, such as the desire to have fewer desires, or the desire to be better at calculating desires. The complexity makes your head hurt, which creates a new desire for relief from intellectual confusion that needs to be classified and calculated. The afternoon brings practical application exercises where you must identify and classify every desire you experience over a 2-hour period. This sounds manageable until you realize how many micro-desires arise during normal activities. Walking to the library, you experience desires for shade, desires for more comfortable sandals, desires to avoid a puddle, desires to walk faster, desires to look at interesting architecture, and desires to not have to think about all these desires. Each one must be noted, classified, and rated for intensity and duration. Your wax tablet fills up with tiny handwriting documenting the constant stream of wants that normally pass through consciousness unnoticed. The desire documentation exercise reveals that most people experience approximately 300 distinct desires per hour during normal waking activities. Advanced practitioners learn to recognize and classify these automatically, making real-time decisions about which desires to satisfy, which to ignore, and which to eliminate through rational analysis. Beginners often become overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of wants requiring attention. Some students drop out during this phase, claiming that the cure for excessive desire is worse than the original problem. Metrodora mentions this matter-of-factly while reviewing your desire log, which contains 127 entries for a 90-minute period. Evening brings the weekly group calculation session, where everyone shares their most challenging pleasure mathematics problems for community problem solving. Tonight's featured case study involves a student named Colotes who experienced pleasure calculation overflow during a music performance last week. While listening to a lyre player, he attempted to simultaneously calculate auditory pleasure, intellectual appreciation of musical structure, social bonding with other listeners, nostalgic memories triggered by specific melodies, and physical comfort of his seating position. The multiple concurrent calculations created processing errors that contaminated his pleasure experience and resulted in negative hedons despite the objectively beautiful music. The group discusses various approaches to multivariable pleasure calculation management. Some students advocate for sequential analysis, where you focus on one pleasure component at a time and sum the results afterward. Others prefer integrated calculation methods that attempt to capture interaction effects between different pleasure sources. Advanced practitioners sometimes use what they call intuitive calculation, where years of practice allow for rapid unconscious mathematics that don't interfere with direct experience. This sounds appealing until you learn that intuitive calculation accuracy requires at least 5 years of intensive training and regular calibration testing. The discussion grows technical as students share calculation shortcuts and efficiency improvements they've developed. Someone has created abbreviated notation systems for common pleasure scenarios. Another student demonstrates a mental abacus technique for rapid hedon arithmetic. A third person explains her color coding system for different desire categories that speeds up classification by 30%. The innovations are impressive in their sophistication and slightly depressing in their necessity. You take notes on calculation optimization while wondering how optimization became necessary for experiencing pleasure. Your turn to share a calculation problem comes during the advanced session, when students present mathematical puzzles that have stumped them. You describe your ongoing struggle with the porridge temperature paradox, where thorough analysis prevents timely consumption, which reduces the pleasure value of the experience being analyzed. This creates a feedback loop where better calculation methodology actually decreases calculated pleasure totals. Several students nod in recognition. This is apparently a common problem with no perfect solution. Apollodorus explains that the porridge paradox represents a fundamental tension in pleasure mathematics between analytical precision and experiential immediacy. Some experiences are inherently damaged by analysis, while others are enhanced by deeper understanding. Learning to distinguish between these categories is an advanced skill that requires extensive practice and careful attention to meta-calculation effects. He estimates that most students need 3 to 4 years to develop reliable intuitions about when calculation helps versus when it hurts. Until then, he recommends systematic experimentation with different analysis approaches while documenting the results for future reference. The evening calculation session concludes with group problem solving on pleasure optimization scheduling. Each day contains approximately 16 waking hours, during which time an experienced practitioner should achieve between 85 and 120 total hedons through careful activity selection and pleasure maximization techniques. However, pleasure calculations themselves consume time that could be spent on pleasure experiences, creating efficiency challenges. The goal is to minimize calculation overhead while maintaining analytical precision sufficient for meaningful optimization. This balance point varies by individual and requires personal calibration through extended experimentation. A senior student shares her daily schedule as an example of advanced optimization. She wakes at dawn and spends 15 minutes on rapid pleasure planning for the day, identifying high probability hidden sources, scheduling them at optimal times based on energy levels and environmental factors. Mid-morning includes a 20-minute calculation review session where she adjusts her plans based on emerging opportunities and actual versus predicted pleasure values. Afternoon features a brief desire classification audit to catch any vain desires that may have developed during the day. Evening concludes with comprehensive hidden accounting and planning adjustments for tomorrow. Total daily calculation time, 67 minutes. Calculation efficiency, 1.4 hidden per minute of analysis time. The mathematics are impressive, but the lifestyle feels exhausting. You ask whether anyone ever achieves pleasure without calculation. Metrodor explains that the ultimate goal of Epicurean training is to internalize pleasure mathematics so completely that optimization becomes unconscious and automatic. Advanced practitioners report experiencing spontaneous pleasure while maintaining perfect analytical precision in the background of awareness. This state typically requires 8 to 10 years of intensive practice and represents the pinnacle of philosophical achievement. Most students never reach this level, but even intermediate calculation skills provide significant improvements in daily pleasure optimization and pain avoidance. Your second day concludes with individual practice time, where you must apply the day's lessons to a personal pleasure optimization project. Your assignment is to analyze and improve the pleasure value of your bedtime routine through systematic calculation and experimental modification. This involves documenting your current routine, measuring pleasure components, identifying optimization opportunities, and testing modifications while tracking hidden changes. The project will continue for 2 weeks and requires daily data collection plus weekly analysis reports. You begin by timing each component of your bedtime routine. Washing takes 8 minutes and provides 0.7 hidden of cleanliness satisfaction plus 0.4 hidden of warm water comfort. Changing into sleeping clothes requires 3 minutes and adds 0.5 hidden of fresh fabric pleasure and 0.6 hidden of physical comfort improvement. Arranging your bedding takes 2 minutes and contributes 0.3 hidden of nest preparation satisfaction. Initial pleasure total 2.5 hidden over 13 minutes, for an efficiency rate of 0.19 hidden per minute. This is below optimal according to the reference standards, indicating significant room for improvement. Potential optimization strategies include longer washing for increased cleanliness pleasure, higher quality sleeping garments for enhanced comfort, more careful bedding arrangement for superior sleep positioning, and additional activities like reading or meditation that could add intellectual or spiritual pleasure components. However, each modification must be tested systematically with proper control conditions to verify actual pleasure improvements versus placebo effects. The experimental protocol requires maintaining detailed logs while alternating between modified and standard routines to isolate variable effects. As you lie in bed documenting your current comfort levels and planning tomorrow's calculation schedule, you realize that bedtime itself has become a mathematical exercise rather than a natural transition to sleep. Your pillow comfort rates 6.2 hedons. Your blanket provides 5.8 hedons of warmth satisfaction, and the room temperature contributes 4.9 hedons of environmental comfort. Total bedtime pleasure 16.9 hedons, assuming optimal sleep quality, which requires 7.3 hours of uninterrupted rest based on your personal sleep efficiency calculations. You close your eyes and try to stop calculating, but your mind continues processing hidden values automatically. Even the attempt to not calculate requires calculation about whether calculation avoidance provides more pleasure than calculation continuation. This meta-calculation creates its own analytical overhead while potentially contaminating the natural sleep transition process. You make a mental note to ask Metrodor about calculation suspension techniques tomorrow, then realize that making mental notes is itself a form of calculation that may be interfering with sleep pleasure optimization. Your dreams involve endless spreadsheets filled with pleasure equations that never quite balance correctly. Even unconsciously, your brain continues working on the mathematical problems of happiness. You wake up several times to write down calculation insights, because good mathematical breakthroughs can't wait until morning, when the inspiration might have faded or been calculated differently upon reflection. This is day 2 in the garden, and you're beginning to understand why some people spend their entire lives here. Not because the philosophy is particularly appealing, but because the calculation requirements are so complex that leaving would mean abandoning years of accumulated mathematical progress. Tomorrow you'll learn about emotional optimization techniques and advanced pain avoidance calculations. Your wax tablets are ready, your bronze measuring instruments are cleaned and calibrated, and your desire classification system has been updated with tonight's new subcategories. The sun will rise again, and you'll be ready to calculate its beauty with improved precision and enhanced analytical efficiency. This feels like progress, though you haven't determined yet whether the feeling of progress itself constitutes a valuable pleasure worth pursuing or a vain desire that should be eliminated through rational analysis. Your 3rd week in the garden introduces the crown jewel of Epicurean philosophy, ataraxia, or perfect tranquility. This is the ultimate goal of all your calculations, the state of absolute serenity that makes every mathematical exercise worthwhile. Achieving ataraxia requires mastering emotional optimization techniques that ensure your mind remains undisturbed by external events, internal conflicts, or calculation errors. The training program begins at dawn with breathing exercises specifically designed to maintain mathematical precision under stress. Metrodor explains that true tranquility cannot be achieved through casual relaxation or simple meditation. These amateur approaches might provide temporary calm, but they lack the systematic rigor necessary for permanent serenity. Authentic ataraxia requires comprehensive emotional monitoring, precise anxiety calculation, and careful implementation of disturbance prevention protocols. She hands you the official Tranquility Maintenance Manual, a leather-bound tome containing 847 pages of detailed instructions for achieving and sustaining inner peace through scientific methodology. The manual begins with fundamental principles that immediately complicate what should be simple concepts. Every emotion must be recognized, classified, and measured before it can be properly managed. Emotional disturbances are categorized as either external origin or internal origin, with different calculation formulas for each type. External disturbances include weather changes, social conflicts, physical discomfort, unexpected events, and what the manual calls environmental pleasure interference patterns. Internal disturbances include excessive desires, irrational fears, calculation errors, meta-anxiety about emotional management itself, and recursive worry loops about worry loops. Each category requires specialized monitoring techniques and specific intervention protocols. External disturbances use a 5-point response system involving immediate recognition, disturbance classification, impact assessment, intervention selection, and effectiveness measurement. Internal disturbances require an 8-step protocol that includes emotional archaeology to determine root causes, desire reclassification analysis, rational counter-argument development, implementation of corrective thinking patterns, monitoring for improvement indicators, adjustment of intervention strategies, documentation of results, and planning for similar future scenarios. Your first practical exercise involves establishing baseline emotional measurables for normal daily activities. You must document your emotional state every 15 minutes throughout the day, rating anxiety levels, desire intensity, physical comfort, and overall tranquility on standardized scales that range from -10 to +10 with detailed criteria for each numerical assignment. This creates a personal emotional profile that identifies your specific vulnerability patterns, optimal intervention timing, peak disturbance periods, and individual stability indicators. The data collection period lasts 6 weeks and requires carrying measurement tablets everywhere while maintaining precise documentation even during sleep disruptions. The measurement process proves more challenging than expected because emotions resist standardization. What starts as mild contentment while reading can shift to frustration with difficult passages, then to anxiety about falling behind schedule, then to meta-anxiety about feeling anxious, then to confusion about whether confusion counts as anxiety or constitutes a separate emotional category requiring different measurement protocols. By the time you finish documenting one emotional state, you've experienced 3 more that also need documentation, creating an emotional documentation backlog that becomes its own source of anxiety requiring separate analysis. Apollodorus supervises your emotional measurement training with his characteristic methodical patience and an increasingly complex series of calibration exercises. He explains that beginners often struggle with emotional classification because they haven't yet learned to observe feelings objectively rather than experiencing them subjectively. Advanced practitioners develop what he calls emotional dissociation, where they can monitor their feelings with scientific detachment while maintaining perfect tranquility regardless of what emotions arise. This skill typically requires 18 months of intensive practice, regular calibration testing against standardized emotional scenarios, and periodic recertification to prevent accuracy drift. The calibration testing involves exposing yourself to controlled disturbances while measuring your emotional responses and practicing optimization techniques. Week 1 focuses on minor physical discomfort, sitting on increasingly uncomfortable surfaces, eating progressively unpalatable foods, and maintaining awkward body positions while continuing normal calculation activities. You must document your discomfort levels using the standardized pain measurement system, implement tranquility maintenance protocols according to approved diseases, and measure the effectiveness of different coping strategies through before and after emotional assessments. The goal is to achieve complete emotional stability regardless of physical circumstances. The physical discomfort training progresses systematically from trivial inconveniences to genuine hardship scenarios. Day 1 involves sitting on a wooden bench with a slightly uneven surface while performing routine pleasure calculations. Day 3 requires maintaining mathematical precision while sitting on deliberately uncomfortable stones arranged to create pressure points. By day 7, you're expected to solve complex optimization problems while seated on a surface specifically designed to cause muscle fatigue and joint discomfort. Advanced students can complete full daily calculation schedules while lying on beds of sharp pebbles without showing any signs of distraction or emotional disturbance. Week 2 introduces social disturbance training, which sounds manageable until you experience it systematically. Other students deliberately disagree with your calculations, interrupt your concentration at predetermined intervals, and create minor interpersonal conflicts while you practice maintaining perfect serenity. This requires simultaneous mathematical precision and psychological discipline that most people haven't developed. When Lianchen politely suggests that your porridge pleasure rating methodology contains fundamental errors, you experience what the manual classifies as defensive anxiety combined with intellectual frustration and social harmony disruption concern. Managing these emotions while recalculating your porridge mathematics proves surprisingly difficult because the social dynamics create additional calculation variables. You must factor in the pleasure impact of maintaining harmonious relationships, the potential hedon loss from appearing defensive, the intellectual satisfaction of mathematical accuracy versus the social cost of disagreement, and the meta-pleasure considerations of learning from criticism versus the immediate comfort of maintaining your original position. The equations become complex enough to require their own dedicated calculation sessions. The social disturbance exercises reveal that emotional optimization conflicts with community harmony in ways that create cascading mathematical problems. Maintaining perfect tranquility often requires ignoring other people's emotional needs, which creates community tension that disturbs everyone's serenity, which generates additional calculation requirements for managing group dynamics. When someone asks for help with their calculations while you're practicing detachment meditation, you must choose between personal tranquility optimization and community cooperation obligations while calculating the hidden implications of both choices. Week 3 introduces the most challenging disturbance category, calculation-related stress management. You must learn to maintain emotional equilibrium, even when your mathematical work contains errors, produces paradoxical results, requires more time than available, or conflicts with previous calculations that you've already incorporated into daily planning decisions. This training begins with deliberately introducing small errors into your pleasure calculations and practicing acceptance of imperfect results while maintaining productivity standards. Watching your daily hidden totals become inaccurate while maintaining serenity feels like allowing someone to randomly rearrange your personal belongings while smiling peacefully. The error tolerance exercises progress from minor calculation mistakes to major mathematical failures that threaten the foundation of your entire philosophical practice. First, you practice accepting 5% errors in simple addition problems without emotional disturbance. Then 10% errors in complex multivariable pleasure equations that affect daily planning decisions. Eventually, you work up to maintaining tranquility while your entire calculation system produces meaningless results due to fundamental methodological flaws that invalidate weeks of previous work. Advanced students can watch their pleasure mathematics collapse into chaos while maintaining expressions of serene contentment and continuing to work on new calculations as if nothing had happened. Metrodora demonstrates advanced tranquility techniques during a particularly challenging calculation session that serves as both education and endurance testing. While solving a complex problem involving optimal pleasure distribution for communal meals with 43 people who have different dietary restrictions, personal preferences, philosophical opinions about food, varying hunger cycles, social relationship dynamics, and conflicting schedule requirements, she maintains perfect calm even when the mathematics become obviously impossible. The problem has no solution that satisfies all constraints, involves contradictory requirements that cannot be reconciled, and requires calculating variables that depend on other variables in circular logic patterns. The demonstration continues for 3 hours while the mathematical impossibility becomes increasingly apparent to everyone watching. Metrodora works through equations that contradict each other, applies formulas to situations that don't match the formula assumptions, and maintains detailed documentation of results that clearly cannot be implemented in practical reality. Her tranquility remains undisturbed by mathematical impossibility, logical contradictions, or the obvious futility of the exercise. She explains afterward that attachment to successful outcomes is a form of vain desire that must be eliminated through rational analysis regardless of practical consequences. Your advanced tranquility training includes meditation exercises that combine mathematical precision with emotional emptiness in ways that feel increasingly unnatural. You sit in prescribed positions that become uncomfortable after 20 minutes while conducting complex pleasure calculations in your mind, maintaining awareness of both the mathematical processes and your emotional responses to the work, and monitoring your monitoring to ensure that self-observation doesn't create additional disturbance. Any attachment to getting correct answers, frustration with difficult problems, satisfaction from successful calculations, or concern about the philosophical implications of emotional detachment must be recognized and dissolved through rational analysis. The meditation sessions last increasingly longer as your detachment skills develop and the training requirements become more demanding. Beginning practitioners meditate for 30 minutes while solving simple addition problems and maintaining awareness of their emotional responses. Intermediate students work for 2 hours on moderate calculations while practicing emotional neutrality toward both success and failure. Advanced practitioners can maintain tranquil calculation states for entire days, solving complex mathematical problems with perfect emotional neutrality, while remaining completely indifferent to whether their work produces useful results or contributes to community welfare. Some senior students report achieving states where mathematical work continues automatically while their consciousness remains in pure, undisturbed serenity, creating a split between analytical function and emotional experience that allows perfect productivity without personal investment in outcomes. This condition sounds either enlightened or deeply disturbing, depending on your philosophical perspective and personal attachment to caring about your own activities. The training manual presents it as the ultimate achievement of Epicurean practice, while some students privately question whether such complete detachment represents human flourishing or psychological dysfunction. The most challenging aspect of tranquility training involves learning to detach from the desire for tranquility itself, creating recursive philosophical problems that require increasingly sophisticated analytical approaches. Wanting to achieve ataraxia creates anxiety about your current emotional state, which disturbs the very serenity you're trying to establish, which generates more anxiety about your inability to maintain calm, which creates additional disturbance that prevents the peace you're seeking. This creates what the manual calls the tranquility paradox, where efforts to become peaceful generate disturbance that prevents peace, requiring detachment from detachment itself. The solution requires eliminating attachment to emotional outcomes while maintaining motivation to continue the training program, creating a psychological state where you work toward goals you don't care about achieving using methods you're not invested in succeeding with. Advanced students describe this as wanting nothing while working toward everything, or caring deeply about not caring about anything, or maintaining passionate commitment to complete indifference. The logical contradictions involved in these descriptions suggest that the achievement may be beyond rational explanation, requiring either transcendence of normal thinking patterns or complete abandonment of coherent self-understanding. Group tranquility sessions test your emotional stability in social contexts, where everyone's serenity affects everyone else's ability to maintain calm, creating collective psychology experiments that feel like emotional endurance contests. When 43 people sit together practicing emotional detachment, individual disturbances can create cascade effects that disrupt the entire community's equilibrium through mechanisms that nobody fully understands but everyone can observe. If someone's calculation errors create anxiety that spreads to nearby students through subtle social cues, the group's collective tranquility becomes compromised, requiring community-wide intervention protocols and group recalibration exercises. These sessions require monitoring both personal emotional states and community emotional dynamics while maintaining individual serenity regardless of social circle, creating multi-layered awareness requirements that challenge most people's cognitive capacity. You must track your own feelings, observe others' emotional indicators, assess group harmony levels, implement appropriate personal responses, and maintain mathematical productivity, while ensuring that your tranquility maintenance efforts don't disturb anyone else's practice. The complexity creates what some students call meditation overload, where the effort required to maintain perfect practice prevents the peace that practice is supposed to achieve. The community tranquility exercises reveal that perfect individual detachment can feel antisocial and emotionally cold in ways that undermine community harmony and create new sources of disturbance. When your friend experiences calculation difficulties and seeks emotional support, maintaining strict philosophical detachment requires ignoring their distress while appearing sympathetic, creating interpersonal dishonesty that conflicts with other philosophical principles. When someone celebrates a mathematical breakthrough, sharing their joy creates attachment to positive outcomes that compromises your tranquility, but failing to share appropriate responses creates social isolation that disturbs community welfare. Advanced practitioners learn to simulate appropriate emotional responses while maintaining internal emptiness, developing what amounts to performed humanity that meets social expectations without creating personal attachment. This skill is highly valued by instructors but feels increasingly artificial to students who remember experiencing genuine emotions before philosophical training taught them to treat feelings as calculation errors. The disconnect between internal experience and external behavior becomes a permanent feature of advanced practice, creating philosophical questions about authenticity that cannot be resolved without abandoning either emotional detachment or honest social interaction. Your training progresses to environmental disturbance management, where you practice maintaining serenity during weather changes, loud noises, uncomfortable temperatures, and other external challenges that test your ability to remain mathematically productive regardless of physical circumstances. The garden's controlled environment limits natural disturbance opportunities, so artificial challenges are created through systematic exposure to planned discomforts designed by instructors who have clearly given considerable thought to making students miserable while calling it education. Students take turns creating noise while others practice calculation work, eating intentionally unpalatable foods while maintaining mathematical precision, working outside during rain or excessive heat while preserving emotional equilibrium, and conducting complex philosophical discussions while experiencing deliberately engineered physical discomfort. The exercises are effective at building disturbance tolerance, but thoroughly unpleasant in ways that make you question whether philosophical advancement should require so much deliberately induced suffering. The environmental training sessions feel like endurance tests disguised as philosophy, with educational objectives that seem secondary to testing psychological limits. Calculating pleasure values while sitting in direct sunlight during the hottest part of the day requires both intellectual focus and physical tolerance that most people haven't developed. Maintaining tranquility while other students deliberately create distracting sounds using instruments apparently designed for maximum annoyance tests your detachment from comfort preferences in ways that feel more like torture preparation than wisdom cultivation. Working through complex mathematical problems while eating intentionally oversalted food challenges your ability to separate intellectual work from sensory displeasure. Creating artificial difficulties that serve no obvious purpose except proving that you can endure them. The philosophical justification involves building resilience against life's inevitable hardships, but the training feels designed more to break down normal human responses than to develop genuine wisdom or practical life skills. Advanced environmental training introduces what Apollodorus calls artificial crisis scenarios, where students face carefully designed challenges that simulate real-world disturbances while practicing philosophical responses under controlled laboratory conditions. These scenarios include having your calculation tablets accidentally destroyed through staged mishaps, discovering systematic errors in weeks of mathematical work through planted mistakes, being assigned impossible problems with unrealistic deadlines that cannot be met regardless of effort, and dealing with interpersonal conflicts that threaten community harmony through artificial disagreements created by instructors. Your emotional responses are monitored and evaluated while you implement optimal philosophical solutions, according to predetermined criteria that measure detachment more than effectiveness. The scenarios feel artificial in ways that undermine their educational value, since everyone knows the crises are manufactured specifically for training purposes, rather than genuine challenges requiring authentic responses. Maintaining tranquility during fake emergencies requires different psychological skills than managing real difficulties, but the training treats simulated and authentic challenges as equivalent. The crisis scenarios reveal that tranquility training creates a fundamental disconnect from normal human responses to difficulty, replacing natural emotional reactions with calculated philosophical performances that may not translate to genuine situations. When your mathematical work is accidentally erased through staged equipment failure, natural emotions include frustration, disappointment, and anxiety about lost time. The philosophical response requires immediate acceptance, emotional neutrality, and calm restart of the work without any attachment to the previous effort or concern about efficiency loss. This response feels mechanically correct but emotionally hollow, creating a sense that philosophical training is replacing human nature with artificial responses that serve theoretical ideals rather than practical wisdom. You begin to question whether philosophical perfection requires abandoning authentic emotional experience entirely, or whether the training is creating psychological dysfunction disguised as spiritual advancement. The questions cannot be answered within the philosophical framework itself, since questioning the system demonstrates attachment to outcomes that must be eliminated through further detachment training. Your most challenging tranquility test involves a week-long period where everything that can go wrong does go wrong, apparently by accident but actually by careful design that becomes obvious once you understand the pattern. Your measurements are inconsistent due to deliberately sabotaged equipment. Your calculations contain systematic errors introduced through planted reference material. Your daily schedule gets disrupted by unexpected events that mysteriously affect only your activities, and other students create constant minor disturbances that interfere with concentration while appearing entirely natural and coincidental. You must maintain perfect serenity while your philosophical practice falls apart around you through circumstances that become increasingly obvious as manufactured difficulties rather than genuine challenges. This test has a 40% pass rate among advanced students, with failure defined as showing any behavioral changes indicating internal disturbance, regardless of whether maintaining productivity under such circumstances represents realistic philosophical preparation or simply psychological endurance training. The week begins with minor calculation equipment malfunctions that slow your mathematical work without creating obvious causes for the delays, requiring detective work to identify problems that feel like normal wear and tear until they accumulate into patterns. Your measuring instruments provide inconsistent readings that vary randomly within ranges small enough to seem like normal variation, but large enough to invalidate calculation accuracy. Your wax tablets develop surface irregularities that make writing difficult in ways that appear accidental but systematically interfere with documentation requirements. Your reference books contain pages that stick together randomly, creating access problems that feel like coincidence but follow patterns designed to maximize frustration. These problems feel like normal equipment issues until you realize that other students' materials work perfectly while only your supplies experience difficulties that creates exactly the types of challenges covered in theoretical training modules. Maintaining tranquility while working with unreliable tools requires constant adaptation and emotional flexibility, but recognizing the artificial nature of the challenges creates meta-level disturbance about being manipulated that must also be managed through philosophical detachment techniques. Day 3 introduces social disturbances that feel natural but systematically undermine your concentration through carefully orchestrated interpersonal interference. Other students ask for help during your designated individual work time, invite you to participate in activities that conflict with your schedule, create conversations near your study area that require constant effort to ignore, and generate minor disputes that demand attention and resolution. Each disturbance is socially reasonable and individually minor, but together they create an environment where focused work becomes nearly impossible through accumulated interference. Your emotional detachment gets tested by socially appropriate but philosophically challenging situations that require choosing between community cooperation and personal practice requirements. Refusing help requests maintains your schedule but violates community principles. Participating in group activities demonstrates social harmony but undermines individual achievement. Ignoring nearby conversations preserves concentration but appears antisocial. The choices involve competing philosophical values that cannot be resolved through detachment alone, requiring practical decision-making that creates attachment to outcomes regardless of which option you choose. By day 5, the accumulated stresses reveal the limitations of philosophical detachment training when applied to systematic interference designed specifically to overwhelm coping capacity. Your mathematical work is behind schedule due to equipment problems and social interruptions, Your emotional monitoring documentation is incomplete because of time constraints and measurement difficulties, and your calculation accuracy has decreased significantly due to constant distraction and unreliable tools. Maintaining tranquility requires ignoring these problems, but ignoring them makes them worse, which creates more disturbance to be ignored in an escalating cycle of philosophical failure. The test concludes with what appears to be a completely accidental disaster, where all your written work for the past month gets damaged in a sudden rainstorm that finds the one leak in the library roof directly above your storage area, soaking weeks of careful documentation while leaving everyone else's materials completely dry. Watching accumulated mathematical progress turn into illegible smears while maintaining philosophical serenity requires every tranquility technique you've learned plus emotional resources you didn't know you possessed. Some students break down crying at this point, others laugh hysterically. A few maintain perfect calm while internally screaming. The test administrators take detailed notes on everyone's responses for evaluation purposes. Metrodor explains afterward that the disaster was entirely artificial, created specifically to test your attachment to outcomes and your ability to maintain tranquility during genuine loss that threatens months of accumulated progress. Advanced practitioners should experience no emotional disturbance when their work disappears, because attachment to personal achievements represents a failure of philosophical understanding that prevents authentic tranquility. The work itself was never important, only the serenity maintained while performing the work has lasting value. This explanation is logically sound within the philosophical framework, but emotionally devastating to anyone who retains normal human investment in their efforts and achievements. Your fourth month in the garden introduces the complexities of communal living, where individual pleasure optimization becomes a collective mathematical problem requiring constant negotiation, compromise, and social calculation that makes personal heat and accounting seem simple by comparison. Every decision affects 43 other people's daily pleasure totals, creating interconnected optimization challenges that require advanced mathematical skills, diplomatic sensitivity, and emotional detachment techniques that few students have fully developed. The community operates on principles that sound harmonious until you experience the practical implementation requirements. Property sharing means that every personal possession decision becomes a group calculation problem involving usage schedules, maintenance responsibilities, replacement costs, and equitable distribution formulas that account for individual needs, community welfare, and philosophical principles about material attachment. The garden owns collectively everything from furniture and cooking equipment to books, musical instruments, and personal clothing items that rotate among residents based on need assessments, pleasure optimization calculations, and availability algorithms that require constant updating and recalibration as circumstances change. Your first community assignment involves managing the shared library system, which sounds straightforward until you discover that 43 people with different reading speeds, intellectual interests, research requirements, and study schedules need access to 247 books through a reservation system that optimizes reading pleasure while ensuring equitable access and minimal waiting times. Each book has different demand levels based on seasonal curriculum requirements, individual research projects, pleasure reading preferences, and philosophical debate topics that create fluctuating usage patterns requiring dynamic allocation adjustments. The library management calculations involve predicting reading completion times for different people with various texts, estimating pleasure values for delayed access to desired books, balancing individual preferences against community learning objectives, and maintaining optimal circulation rates that prevent books from sitting idle, while minimizing waiting periods that create frustration and reduce overall community hedon totals. The mathematical complexity requires tracking 43 individual reading histories, 247 book characteristics, and thousands of possible scheduling combinations that change daily based on new requests and completed readings. Metrodor explains that library optimization represents a simplified version of the community resource allocation challenges that advanced students encounter in more complex shared systems. Food distribution requires similar calculations involving individual dietary needs, taste preferences, health restrictions, and philosophical positions about nutrition that must be balanced against ingredient availability, preparation time requirements, cooking skill distributions, and cleanup responsibility rotations. Housing assignments consider sleep patterns, noise tolerance, social compatibility, and privacy preferences while maintaining equal access to desirable living spaces and optimal community harmony. The mathematical frameworks for these calculations become so complex that the Garden employs dedicated calculation specialists who spend their entire time solving optimization problems for different community systems rather than pursuing individual philosophical development. These specialists, known as harmony coordinators, maintain massive calculation tables that track resource usage patterns, predict future needs, identify optimization opportunities, and generate daily allocation recommendations that theoretically maximize collective pleasure while maintaining individual satisfaction and philosophical principle adherence. Your introduction to community calculation work begins with food preparation scheduling, where you must coordinate meal planning for 43 people with varying dietary restrictions, taste preferences, philosophical opinions about different foods, individual cooking skills, available preparation time, seasonal ingredient availability, and budget constraints that limit expensive items while maintaining nutritional adequacy and reasonable pleasure levels. The optimization challenge involves creating weekly menus that satisfy all constraints while maximizing collective meal satisfaction and minimizing preparation effort and cost overruns. The meal planning calculations require extensive data about individual food preferences, which means surveying everyone about their pleasure ratings for hundreds of different ingredients, preparation methods, flavor combinations, and presentation styles. This information must be updated regularly because taste preferences change over time, seasonal availability affects pleasure ratings for different foods, and philosophical development can alter people's attitudes toward luxury items, simple foods, and the role of culinary pleasure and overall life satisfaction. Creating a single dinner menu that satisfies 43 different preference profiles while staying within budget constraints and available preparation time requires solving equations with thousands of variables and competing objectives that often have no perfect solution. Advanced practitioners learn to accept suboptimal outcomes that represent the best available compromise among competing needs, but beginners often become frustrated by the mathematical impossibility of satisfying everyone simultaneously while maintaining philosophical principles about desire management and pleasure optimization. Your first week managing dinner planning produces meals that technically meet all requirements but satisfy no one completely, creating community tension that requires additional diplomatic calculations to resolve. When your mathematically optimized menu includes foods that individuals dislike but accept for community harmony, the resulting meal experiences generate negative hedons that reduce overall community pleasure totals despite theoretical optimization. The gap between mathematical perfection and practical satisfaction becomes a recurring theme in all community calculation projects. The social dynamics of shared decision-making create additional calculation requirements that aren't covered in individual philosophy training. When someone disagrees with your resource allocation decisions, you must balance mathematical accuracy against social harmony, personal authority against community consensus, and efficient decision-making against inclusive participation. These choices involve meta-level calculations about the pleasure value of different decision-making processes, the hedon costs of conflict resolution, and the long-term community welfare implications of various compromise strategies. Community meetings for resolving allocation disputes become calculation workshops where 43 people attempt to solve optimization problems collectively while managing individual emotions, group dynamics, and time constraints that limit detailed mathematical analysis. The meetings typically involve extensive discussion of calculation methodologies, heated debate about priority weighting systems, and careful analysis of alternative solutions that might better serve community needs while maintaining philosophical consistency and practical feasibility. Your second month focuses on relationship management within the community, where personal friendships, romantic partnerships, and social conflicts must be analyzed and optimized using pleasure calculation principles that treat human emotions as mathematical variables requiring careful management and optimization. The garden's inclusive social structure, which welcomes people regardless of gender, social status, or background, creates complex interpersonal dynamics that affect everyone's daily pleasure totals through mechanisms that are difficult to predict and control. Friendship optimization requires calculating the pleasure value of different social interactions, balancing time spent with various people, and managing social group dynamics that affect individual relationships and community harmony. Each friendship has different maintenance requirements, pleasure generation patterns, and potential conflict sources that must be monitored and managed through careful attention to social signals, communication patterns, and shared activity planning that maximizes mutual satisfaction while avoiding jealousy or exclusion problems. The mathematical approach to friendship feels artificial, but produces measurable improvements in social satisfaction when applied systematically. By tracking pleasure levels during different types of social activities, identifying conversation topics that generate positive responses, and scheduling social time to optimize emotional benefits while minimizing conflict risks, students report increased social comfort and reduced interpersonal anxiety. However, the analytical approach also creates distance from spontaneous emotional connection and natural relationship development that many people find disturbing. Romantic relationships within the community require even more complex calculations involving emotional attachment management, jealousy prevention, and community impact assessment that must balance individual pleasure optimization against group harmony and philosophical principle adherence. The garden's open approach to sexuality and partnership creates opportunities for relationship experimentation, while requiring careful attention to emotional consequences that affect multiple people and potentially destabilize community dynamics if managed poorly. Your relationship management training includes practical exercises in emotional detachment during romantic interactions, pleasure calculation for different types of physical and emotional intimacy, and conflict resolution techniques that maintain philosophical serenity while addressing practical relationship problems. The training feels clinical and detached in ways that conflict with normal romantic emotions, but advanced practitioners report achieving satisfying relationships that avoid common sources of suffering through rational management of expectations and careful attention to mutual pleasure optimization. The community's approach to managing jealousy and romantic conflict involves treating these emotions as calculation errors that can be corrected through rational analysis and proper application of philosophical principles about desire management. When someone experiences jealousy about their partner's relationships with others, the recommended response involves analyzing the underlying desires that create possessive feelings, reclassifying these desires as vain rather than natural, and implementing detachment techniques that eliminate emotional attachment to exclusive partnership arrangements. This approach works better in theory than practice. While some students successfully eliminate jealous feelings through philosophical analysis, others find that rational understanding doesn't prevent emotional responses that feel natural and appropriate. The conflict between philosophical ideals and human psychology creates ongoing tension within the community that requires constant management through group discussion, individual counseling, and social arrangement modifications that accommodate people's actual emotional needs rather than their theoretical philosophical commitments. Your third month involves learning to manage social conflicts that arise when individual pleasure optimization goals conflict with community welfare requirements, or when different people's philosophical interpretations create disagreements about proper conduct, resource allocation priorities, or relationship management approaches. These conflicts require diplomatic skills that aren't taught in individual philosophy training but become essential for community survival and harmony maintenance. Conflict resolution in the garden follows structured protocols that treat disagreements as optimization problems requiring mathematical analysis and rational solution development rather than emotional expression or power-based resolution. When conflicts arise, the involved parties must present their positions using standardized argument formats that include pleasure calculations supporting evidence, philosophical principle citations, and proposed solutions that address underlying needs while maintaining community harmony and individual satisfaction. The formal approach to conflict resolution feels artificial and cumbersome during emotional disputes, but it prevents arguments from escalating into personal attacks or community division. By requiring rational analysis of underlying concerns and systematic evaluation of potential solutions, the process typically produces workable compromises that address practical problems while maintaining philosophical consistency. However, the emotional labor required for this approach creates its own stress that some people find more burdensome than the original conflicts. Community discipline procedures for handling serious violations of garden principles or community agreements involve collective calculation sessions where everyone participates in analyzing the problem, evaluating different response options, and selecting appropriate interventions that balance individual correction needs against community protection requirements. These sessions feel like mathematical tribunals where human behavior gets analyzed using pleasure optimization principles and philosophical theory rather than traditional justice concepts. Your participation in a community discipline case involving someone who repeatedly violated resource-sharing agreements by hoarding books and cooking equipment reveals the challenges of applying mathematical analysis to complex human behavior problems. The calculations involve assessing the hidden damage caused by selfish behavior, evaluating different intervention strategies for behavioral modification, and balancing individual rehabilitation goals against community protection needs through rational analysis that feels inadequate for addressing emotional and moral dimensions of the situation. The final month of your community integration training focuses on leadership development, where advanced students learn to coordinate group calculation projects, facilitate community decision-making processes, and manage the social and mathematical complexity of collective pleasure optimization. Leadership in the garden requires mastering both analytical skills for solving complex optimization problems and interpersonal skills for managing group dynamics during collaborative work on challenging mathematical and social challenges. Leadership training begins with managing small project teams working on specific calculation problems, such as optimizing garden maintenance schedules to balance agricultural productivity with individual labor preferences and seasonal work distribution requirements. These projects require coordinating multiple people with different skills, schedules, and work preferences while maintaining productivity standards and ensuring equitable labor distribution that doesn't create resentment or burnout among community members. Your first leadership assignment involves coordinating a 5-person team responsible for optimizing the community's daily schedule to minimize conflicts between individual study time, group activities, communal meals, maintenance work, and recreational pursuits. The project requires collecting schedule preferences from 43 people, identifying potential conflicts and overlaps, developing alternative arrangements that accommodate different needs, and implementing solutions that maximize collective satisfaction while maintaining essential community functions. The mathematical complexity of schedule optimization creates project management challenges that require both technical problem-solving skills and diplomatic sensitivity for handling disagreements about priorities, methodologies, and implementation strategies. Team members often have different opinions about calculation approaches, weighting systems for competing objectives, and acceptable compromise solutions that require negotiation and consensus building in addition to mathematical analysis. Your team spends 6 weeks developing a comprehensive scheduling system that theoretically optimizes community time allocation, while satisfying individual preferences and maintaining essential activities. The final proposal includes detailed implementation procedures, conflict resolution protocols, and ongoing optimization mechanisms that allow continuous improvement based on feedback and changing circumstances. The mathematical elegance of the solution impresses community leaders, but practical implementation reveals numerous problems that weren't apparent during theoretical development. The gap between theoretical optimization and practical implementation becomes a recurring theme in all leadership projects. Mathematical solutions that work perfectly on calculation tablets often fail when applied to real people with changing needs, unpredictable preferences, and emotional responses that resist rational optimization. Advanced leaders learn to design implementation systems that accommodate human unpredictability while maintaining mathematical rigor and philosophical consistency. Your leadership development includes training in group facilitation techniques for managing community meetings, calculation workshops, and collaborative problem-solving sessions that require balancing individual participation against efficient decision-making and ensuring all voices are heard while maintaining focus on mathematical analysis and rational solution development. These skills prove essential for maintaining community harmony during challenging projects that involve complex calculations and competing interests. The community's democratic decision-making processes require leaders who can guide discussions through complex mathematical analysis while managing emotional responses, personality conflicts, and philosophical disagreements that affect group dynamics and decision quality. Effective facilitation involves creating structured environments where people can express concerns and preferences while maintaining focus on rational analysis and collaborative solution development rather than emotional expression or power struggles. Advanced leadership training includes crisis management techniques for handling community emergencies, resource shortages, interpersonal conflicts, and external threats that require rapid decision-making under pressure while maintaining philosophical principles and community cohesion. These scenarios test leaders' ability to apply optimization principles under stress while managing group anxiety and individual emotional responses that can destabilize community functioning during difficult periods. Your final leadership assessment involves managing a simulated crisis where external political pressure threatens the garden's continued existence, while internal resource shortages create competition among community members for limited supplies. The scenario requires making rapid decisions about resource allocation, community security, and individual welfare while maintaining philosophical consistency and group unity during circumstances that challenge fundamental principles about shared property and collective decision-making. The crisis simulation reveals the limitations of mathematical optimization when applied to situations involving genuine scarcity, external threats, and emotional stress that overwhelm rational calculation capacity. While philosophical principles provide general guidance for decision-making, practical leadership requires intuitive judgment and rapid response capabilities that can't always wait for comprehensive calculation analysis. Advanced leaders learn to balance mathematical rigor with practical necessity while maintaining community confidence and philosophical integrity. Your leadership development concludes with advanced training in community expansion planning, where you learn to analyze and manage the mathematical and social challenges involved in incorporating new members into existing community systems while maintaining optimization efficiency and philosophical standards. Expansion decisions require careful analysis of candidate compatibility, resource impact assessment, and integration planning that ensures community growth doesn't destabilize existing systems or reduce overall satisfaction levels. The expansion planning process involves developing comprehensive evaluation criteria for prospective members, creating integration protocols that help new people adapt to community calculation requirements, and designing growth management systems that maintain community culture while accommodating increased scale and complexity. These challenges require both mathematical analysis skills and deep understanding of community dynamics that affect long-term stability and satisfaction. Community expansion creates optimization challenges that increase exponentially with size as the number of possible relationships, resource allocation combinations, and decision-making variables grows beyond manageable calculation capacity. Advanced planning requires developing simplified systems that maintain optimization benefits while reducing computational complexity to levels that remain practically manageable with available time and analytical resources. Your final community project involves developing a comprehensive manual for new community leaders that documents optimal practices for managing collective calculation projects, facilitating group decision-making, and maintaining community harmony while preserving philosophical principles and mathematical rigor. The manual represents the accumulated wisdom of your community training experience and serves as a reference resource for future leaders facing similar challenges. The manual creation process requires synthesizing mathematical techniques, social management strategies, and philosophical principles into practical guidance that can be applied by people with varying levels of experience and different leadership styles. The work involves extensive collaboration with experienced community leaders, systematic documentation of best practices, and careful attention to implementation details that affect practical utility and user accessibility. Creating comprehensive leadership documentation reveals the extent to which community management has become a specialized field requiring dedicated study and practice rather than natural social skills that most people develop through normal life experience. The Garden's mathematical approach to human relationships and social organization creates unique challenges that require specialized knowledge and systematic training that few people receive in conventional social environments. As your community integration training concludes, you realize that living with 43 other people while optimizing collective pleasure and maintaining individual philosophical development requires skills that weren't covered in your original Epicurean education. The mathematical tools for analyzing pleasure and desire provide useful frameworks for understanding human behavior, but practical community management requires diplomatic sensitivity, emotional intelligence, and leadership capabilities that complement rather than replace analytical philosophical training. The community experience demonstrates that individual philosophical perfection becomes meaningless without social systems that support collective flourishing and mutual satisfaction. Advanced practitioners must master both personal optimization techniques and community management skills that enable groups of people to work together effectively while pursuing shared philosophical goals and maintaining individual autonomy within collective decision-making frameworks. Your understanding of Epicurean philosophy has evolved from personal pleasure calculation to complex social optimization that requires balancing competing needs, managing group dynamics, and facilitating collaborative decision-making while maintaining mathematical rigor and philosophical consistency. The challenge involves applying theoretical principles to practical situations that involve unpredictable human behavior and changing circumstances that resist simple optimization solutions. Tomorrow begins your final month of training, where you'll integrate individual philosophical mastery with community leadership skills, while preparing for potential departure from the garden to apply Epicurean principles in the broader world beyond this controlled environment. Your calculation tablets are filled with community management insights. Your leadership experience includes successful project coordination, and your understanding of collective optimization encompasses both mathematical sophistication and practical wisdom about human nature and social dynamics. Your final month in the garden brings the ultimate test, philosophical burnout syndrome, a condition that affects approximately 60% of students who complete advanced Epicurean training. The symptoms begin subtly with decreased enthusiasm for daily calculations, reduced precision in pleasure measurements, and growing skepticism about whether mathematical optimization actually improves life satisfaction. Advanced cases involve complete inability to experience spontaneous pleasure without immediately analyzing its hidden value, duration characteristics, and integration requirements with overall daily optimization goals. Metrodor explains that burnout represents a natural transition phase where students either achieve transcendent integration of philosophical principles with lived experience, or recognize that systematic pleasure optimization creates more suffering than the problems it was designed to solve. The Garden's records show that roughly 40% of students who experience burnout syndrome continue with advanced philosophical practice, while the remaining 60% either develop modified approaches that balance calculation with spontaneous experience, or abandon systematic pleasure optimization entirely in favor of more intuitive life management strategies. Your first symptoms appear during routine morning pleasure planning when you realize that the process of optimizing happiness has become more complex and time-consuming than simply experiencing whatever the day naturally provides. The mathematical frameworks that once seemed elegant and helpful now feel like elaborate bureaucratic systems that interfere with direct engagement with life circumstances. You find yourself questioning whether someone who spends 2 hours calculating optimal breakfast pleasure values understands food better than someone who simply eats when hungry and enjoys whatever tastes good. The questioning spreads to other areas of philosophical practice as you notice patterns that weren't apparent during earlier training phases. Students who achieve perfect calculation accuracy often seem less satisfied with their daily experiences than those who maintain some spontaneous responses to unexpected situations. People who successfully eliminate all vain desires sometimes appear emotionally flat and disconnected from normal human motivations that provide meaning and energy for most people. The mathematical precision that the system promises comes at costs that weren't clearly explained during initial training periods. Advanced students who recognize these patterns often develop what instructors call meta-philosophical perspectives, where they begin analyzing the pleasure optimization system itself using the same mathematical tools originally designed for optimizing individual experiences. This analysis reveals systematic problems with the foundational assumptions underlying Epicurean calculation methodology, including circular logic patterns, unmeasurable variables, and optimization targets that change based on the measurement process itself in ways that prevent stable solutions. The meta-analysis becomes particularly problematic when applied to the time allocation question that underlies all philosophical practice. Students typically spend 4 to 6 hours daily on calculation activities, measurement procedures, and optimization planning that could theoretically be used for direct pleasure experiences instead. The mathematical tools designed to maximize pleasure efficiency actually reduce available pleasure time, creating negative returns on analytical investment that worsen as calculation sophistication increases and requires more elaborate measurement and optimization procedures. Your advanced calculation skills now enable you to quantify this problem precisely. Daily calculation overhead costs average 4.3 hours of time that could generate approximately 47 hedons through alternative activities like reading, socializing, exercise, creative work, or simple relaxation. The calculation activities themselves provide roughly 12 hedons from intellectual satisfaction and philosophical achievement, creating a net daily pleasure deficit of 35 hedons that accumulates over time into significant happiness opportunity costs that compound like interest on poorly managed financial investments. The mathematical analysis of philosophical practice creates cognitive dissonance that cannot be resolved within the Epicurean framework itself. The system's own analytical tools demonstrate that optimal pleasure achievement requires abandoning systematic pleasure optimization, but abandoning the system eliminates the analytical capability needed to verify this conclusion. Students who reach this logical impasse often experience existential confusion about the purpose and value of their extended philosophical training. Apollodorus addresses these concerns during advanced seminars on philosophical paradox management, where students learn to accept contradictory conclusions without attempting resolution through further analysis. He explains that logical consistency requirements represent vain desires for intellectual certainty that must be eliminated through rational analysis of their futility. Advanced practitioners develop tolerance for paradox that allows simultaneous commitment to systematic optimization and recognition of its fundamental inadequacy for achieving stated objectives. The paradox tolerance training involves exercises in maintaining philosophical practice while acknowledging its logical problems, calculating pleasure values while recognizing their measurement limitations, and pursuing optimization goals while accepting their theoretical impossibility. This requires psychological flexibility that most people haven't developed and may conflict with normal human needs for coherent worldviews and consistent behavioral frameworks that provide stable foundations for decision-making, identity formation. Your advanced training includes exposure to alternative philosophical approaches that address some limitations of systematic pleasure calculation, while maintaining Epicurean principles about pleasure, desire management, and rational decision-making. These hybrid systems typically involve simplified calculation methods, intuitive optimization techniques, and periodic analytical reviews rather than constant mathematical monitoring of all experiences and decisions. Students who adopt these approaches report improved satisfaction levels and reduced philosophical anxiety while maintaining benefits from systematic attention to pleasure and desire patterns. However, adopting simplified approaches feels like philosophical failure after months of intensive training in comprehensive calculation methodologies. The reduced analytical precision conflicts with perfectionist tendencies that the training process encourages, while simplified decision-making procedures seem crude and inadequate compared to sophisticated mathematical frameworks that account for complex interaction effects and optimization opportunities. Students often struggle with the transition from comprehensive analysis to intuitive judgment despite clear evidence that simplified approaches produce better practical results. The Garden's approach to managing student burnout involves gradual exposure to post-philosophical life through carefully controlled reintegration exercises that test students' ability to function in environments where systematic pleasure optimization isn't practiced or understood. These exercises begin with day trips to Athens where students observe and interact with people who make decisions based on habit, emotion, social pressure, and practical convenience rather than mathematical analysis of optimal outcomes. Your first exposure to unoptimized daily life feels simultaneously liberating and disturbing as you observe people eating food without calculating pleasure values, engaging in conversations without measuring social satisfaction levels, and making decisions based on immediate preferences rather than systematic analysis of long-term hidden implications. The spontaneous behavior appears inefficient and potentially harmful, but the people seem generally satisfied with their experiences and don't show signs of the analytical anxiety that affects most garden residents. The contrast between optimized and unoptimized lifestyles raises questions about the relationship between efficiency and satisfaction that weren't addressed during your philosophical training. People who make suboptimal decisions according to Epicurean calculation methods often appear more relaxed and emotionally connected to their experiences than advanced practitioners who achieve superior mathematical results through systematic optimization procedures. This observation challenges fundamental assumptions about the relationship between rational analysis and human flourishing. Extended exposure to unoptimized social environments reveals that most people develop intuitive decision-making capabilities that produce reasonably good outcomes without explicit calculation procedures. They learn through experience to recognize situations that typically provide satisfaction, avoid circumstances that usually cause problems, and make adjustments based on feedback from previous decisions. This natural learning process appears less precise but more flexible than systematic optimization methods that require extensive advanced planning and detailed measurement procedures. Your reintegration training includes exercises in spontaneous decision-making where you must choose activities, social interactions, and daily plans without calculation support while monitoring the results for comparison with the optimized approaches. The spontaneous decisions initially feel reckless and anxiety-provoking after months of systematic analysis, but gradually become more comfortable as you redevelop intuitive judgment capabilities that were suppressed during intensive philosophical training. The comparison between optimized and spontaneous decision-making reveals that both approaches have advantages depending on circumstances and individual psychology. Systematic optimization works well for people who enjoy analytical processes and have sufficient time for detailed planning, while spontaneous approaches suit people who prefer immediate responsiveness and don't want to invest time in advanced preparation. Most effective practitioners develop hybrid approaches that combine analytical planning for important decisions with intuitive responses for routine choices. Your final philosophical assessment involves designing a personalized life management system that integrates Epicurean principles with practical decision-making approaches suitable for your individual psychology, circumstances, and goals. This system must address pleasure optimization and desire management while remaining simple enough for sustainable long-term implementation without excessive analytical overhead that interferes with direct experience of optimized activities. The assessment process requires honest evaluation of which philosophical techniques actually improve your life satisfaction versus which ones create analytical obligations that reduce available time and energy for enjoyable activities. Most students discover that selective application of calculation methods to significant decisions provides better results than comprehensive optimization of all daily choices, but determining optimal selection criteria requires experimentation and careful attention to individual response patterns. Your personalized system includes simplified pleasure awareness techniques that maintain sensitivity to satisfaction levels without requiring detailed measurement procedures, streamlined desire classification methods that identify problematic wants without exhaustive categorization requirements, and periodic optimization reviews that address accumulated inefficiencies without constant analytical monitoring. The system aims to preserve philosophical benefits while eliminating bureaucratic overhead that characterizes comprehensive implementation approaches. The design process reveals that effective philosophical practice requires balancing analytical sophistication with practical simplicity in ways that weren't emphasized during initial training focused on mastering complex calculation methodologies. Advanced practitioners must develop judgment about when analysis helps versus when it interferes, which decisions benefit from systematic optimization versus which ones work better through intuitive responses, and how much philosophical structure enhances life versus how much creates unnecessary complications. Your graduation from garden training includes certification in both comprehensive Epicurean methodology and simplified practical applications, acknowledging that different approaches suit different people and circumstances. The certification process involves demonstrating competency in analytical techniques while also showing ability to function effectively without constant calculation support when appropriate. This dual competency represents the Garden's recognition that philosophical training should enhance rather than replace natural human decision-making capabilities. The final community celebration of your completed training involves shared reflection on the relationship between philosophical ideals and practical theism, recognizing both the value of systematic approaches to difficult life management problems and the limitations of any analytical system when applied to the full complexity of human experience. Advanced practitioners typically develop personalized approaches that combine elements from different philosophical traditions rather than pure implementation of any single systematic methodology. Your departure from the garden involves transition planning that addresses the psychological adjustment required for returning to social environments where systematic pleasure optimization isn't practiced or understood. This transition often proves more challenging than the original philosophical training because it requires explaining or concealing analytical habits that seem strange to people who haven't experienced systematic approaches to happiness and decision-making. Many graduates report feeling isolated by their philosophical training even when they benefit from improved decision-making capabilities. The long-term follow-up studies of garden graduates show varied outcomes depending on individual psychology and life circumstances. Students who maintain some form of systematic pleasure awareness generally report improved satisfaction levels compared to their pre-training experience, while those who abandon analytical approaches entirely often return to previous satisfaction levels within a few years. The most successful graduates typically develop simplified systems that preserve key insights while avoiding analytical overhead that interferes with spontaneous enjoyment. Your final conversation with Metrodor addresses the central paradox of Epicurean training. The system works best for people who don't need it, while people who most need systematic approaches to happiness often lack the psychological flexibility required for successful implementation. Advanced philosophical practice requires emotional stability, analytical capability, and sufficient life resources to support extended training periods that aren't available to people struggling with basic survival needs or serious psychological problems. The philosophical irony extends to the selection process that determines who receives garden training. People who are already reasonably satisfied with their lives and possess strong analytical skills benefit most from systematic optimization techniques, while people experiencing significant life difficulties often lack the psychological resources needed for successful philosophical practice. This creates a system that enhances advantages for people who are already privileged while providing limited benefits for those who most need improved life management strategies. Metrodor explains that this limitation represents a fundamental characteristic of philosophical approaches that require extensive training and sophisticated implementation rather than a flaw specific to Epicurean methodology. Most systematic approaches to human flourishing work better for people who already possess the psychological and social resources needed for their effective application, while people facing serious challenges often need different types of support that address basic needs before advanced optimization becomes relevant or practical. Your understanding of philosophical practice has evolved from initial enthusiasm for systematic happiness optimization to more nuanced appreciation of both the benefits and limitations of analytical approaches to life management. The garden experience provided valuable tools for understanding pleasure, desire, and decision-making while demonstrating the importance of balancing analytical sophistication with practical simplicity and maintaining connection to natural human responses that analytical training sometimes suppresses or complicates. As you prepare to leave the garden and return to the broader world beyond this controlled philosophical environment, you carry both advanced analytical capabilities and hard-won wisdom about their appropriate application. Your calculation tablets contain sophisticated mathematical frameworks for complex decision-making situations, while your experience includes practical knowledge about when spontaneous responses work better than systematic analysis, how to maintain philosophical benefits without analytical overhead that interferes with direct engagement with life circumstances. The garden's influence on your thinking will persist long after departure, not primarily through continued use of detailed calculation procedures, but through enhanced awareness of pleasure patterns, improved understanding of desire management, and greater sensitivity to optimization opportunities that can be addressed through simplified analytical techniques. The most lasting benefit may be increased confidence in your ability to make good decisions through careful attention to outcomes and systematic adjustment based on experience feedback. Your final morning in the garden begins like every other morning for the past year, with pleasure calculations, desire classification, and optimization planning that have become automatic habits requiring minimal conscious effort. The difference is that today you're calculating these activities for the last time as formal philosophical exercises rather than permanent life management techniques. Tomorrow you'll begin the process of integrating philosophical insights with natural decision-making approaches in environments where systematic optimization isn't expected or understood. The sun rises over the marble columns one final time as you complete your last official calculation session, documenting the pleasure value of philosophical completion and the complex emotions associated with leaving a community that has shaped your understanding of happiness, desire, and rational decision-making. The mathematics capture some aspects of this experience, while missing others that resist quantification, and seem more important than any analytical framework can adequately address. You pack your few possessions, including calculation tablets that represent thousands of hours of mathematical work on optimization problems that seemed critically important at the time, but now feel like elaborate exercises in applied philosophy rather than essential life skills. The tablets will serve as references for complex decisions that benefit from systematic analysis, while most daily choices will return to intuitive processes that feel more natural and require less time and energy than comprehensive optimization procedures. Your departure from the garden represents both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of intensive philosophical training, and the start of practical application of analytical insights in real-world circumstances that include complications and constraints not present in controlled community environments. The challenge involves maintaining philosophical benefits while adapting to social contexts where systematic pleasure optimization seems strange or unnecessarily complicated to people who manage their lives through conventional approaches. As you walk through the garden gates for the final time, you realize that the most valuable aspect of your training may not be the analytical techniques themselves, but the deeper understanding of human psychology and decision-making that comes from systematic attention to pleasure, desire, and optimization processes. This understanding provides a foundation for wise choices that doesn't depend on continued use of formal calculation procedures, but influences judgment in subtle ways that improve long-term satisfaction and life management effectiveness. The road ahead leads back to Athens and eventually to whatever life circumstances await beyond the philosophical sanctuary, where happiness was treated as a mathematical problem requiring analytical solutions. Your philosophical training continues, but now through direct engagement with uncontrolled experiences that will test the practical value of analytical insights while providing opportunities for continued learning about the complex relationship between systematic optimization, human flourishing in all its unpredictable, unmeasurable, and ultimately uncalculable richness.